Shock Piece: The Search for Freedom. A novel by C. Nguyen. Chapter 1. Chaos of Saigon, 1975. The math tutorial class was quite empty today. It had been like this for the last few weeks. Everyone was on edge. Trin sensed from the activities and expressions of the people around her that they were waiting for something to happen. This morning, the television had announced that the last day for all schools would be today. But Trin still came to a private tutorial class because she loved her math. Numbers were always friendly and predictable. They were as simple as 2 plus 2 equals 4. They were never treacherous or deceptive to her. The puzzle was always solved, and the result was straightforward in the end. It was what Trin liked about the subject. It was so much unlike literature and essays, which were mysterious and sometimes biased so that the boundary between truth and untruth, real and unreal, was difficult to define. To go along with the thesis one had chosen to prove, one had to lean on one side or the other to stay logical. Or conversely, illogical, in the eyes of others, Trin reflected. Today she felt 100 years old. She was about to sit down, but then she had to stand up again, as Miss Nguyen had entered the classroom. It was a custom that students should stand up and be quiet when teachers entered and left the classroom. Please sit down. There are no more classes after today, students. Due to the state of turbulence in the country right now and the restrictions imposed on movements, all my tutorial classes will be cancelled. Come back now and then to check with me or the notice board for the date of resumption. She paused for a short while and then continued. Goodbye, students, and I wish you and your family are all safe. Her voice trembled with emotion. She looked about her classroom and took in the faces of those smart, keen kids. The bewildered looks of uncertainty and unease were displayed on those innocent young children as much as on the faces of many adults around her. The whole country was in mourning. The battles were closing in. They had lost Hue, Da Nang, and Buon Me Thuc to the Viet Cong last March. The sadness and perplexity of the near future was overwhelming for the Southerners. It was clear that the South was losing the war, and everyone was afraid that their life was threatened by the communists. There were talks of giving up the fight, and the war was ending. The South Vietnamese armed forces were withdrawing and losing bases. Many operations to evacuate thousands of U.S. personnel and South Vietnamese refugees had begun a month before. The U.S. was leaving, and that triggered panic and alarm among the conservative class. Miss Nguyen was as afraid and helpless as many other teachers and scholars of similar social class. She understood that scholars of the previous regime were not going to be appreciated and honored in the communist system. The future was unfathomable, unclear, and horrifying. She had heard so many talks about how the Viet Cong treated intellectuals in the 1968 Tet Offensive in Hue. There were mass graves in Hue that covered hundreds of Catholics, South Vietnamese armed forces personnel, intellectuals, merchants, executives, and other suspected counter-revolutionaries after the city had been restored for a month under the occupation of the Viet Cong. With that knowledge, she was helpless, but she waited in apprehension like the rest of the population who had no means of escape or had chosen to stay. The class was dismissed. The students had expected that to happen for some time, and they were not surprised. They felt melancholy, filling the air. The pressure was almost suffocating. Trin looked at her friends and the teacher. Anxiety and tension was in everyone's eyes. They stood up and waited to leave after Miss Nguyen's announcement, and talk broke out at once. Talk that seemed bottled up in their chests about the present situation started to brim over and spill out in every direction. Trin gathered her books, stood up with the rest of them, and slowly walked out of the class. She saw a few students approach Miss Nguyen and whisper something in a quiet tone. Miss Nguyen nodded her head in agreement and waved goodbye. Trin bowed her head to the teacher on the way another customary gesture of all Vietnamese students in her time, showing respect to the teachers and elders. It was deep respect, particular to Oriental culture. The teacher-novice relationship in her people was valued for as long as a person's lifetime. To this day, almost 40 years from the day she left Vietnam, Trin knows many colleagues who keep in touch with their teachers and professors from high school to university. From a very young age in her culture, children are taught to appreciate whatever knowledge can be gained from whomever gives it to them. Recently, Trin received news from her high school friends that one of her Vietnamese literature teachers in Year 8, Miss Tu, had passed away in her late 70s. That brought back some childhood memories of the beloved but stern teacher. The whole classroom would sit still, and no one dared to draw attention to themselves in case Miss Tu would call them out to make an example of them to the class. Trin was always one of the ill-fated students. She was singled out for criticism because Miss Tu was very diligent in trying to keep Trin's writing within the confines of the language. She was the best teacher Trin had ever had. Trin still remembered some of her methods in teaching the rhetorical skill of the language. However, Trin chose to express her thoughts differently, and she probably still did. Miss Tu never liked Trin's deviation, and perhaps the Vietnamese Literature League Club, if something like that exists, would not accept her writing. But then, in Year 9, Trin suddenly became the favorite of another literature teacher. She was chosen to represent the whole school for her year to give a speech at the end of year celebration. It came to her that with language, one either likes or dislikes the writer's expressions, and her change of fate might be just due to that. It came as always in math that Trin knew when she was right or wrong, and she was confident with it most of the time. Out of turn, she came up to Miss Nguyen, gathered her courage, and asked, "Are you going anywhere, Miss Nguyen?" The teacher looked up at one of her beloved students and shook her head. "Where to, Trin?" "You know, going away from Saigon, from Vietnam, to America." Miss Nguyen smiled sadly in return. "Darling, you know that I'm a mere public high school math teacher. Where can I afford to go? I've got no connections or relatives or money to contemplate an idea like that, even though I've wished for it." "But, Miss Nguyen, everyone is talking of going or getting out of the city. I've heard that from every person I've met." Miss Nguyen patted Trin's head gently. "Yes, it's a shame everyone's thinking of that. Even I am. But not everyone can, sweetie. I'm as poor as every other teacher in the country. Besides, what can I do once I'm out of here? I'm going to be just like a fish out of water, Kitty. I'm going to miss my students, and my life will be without a purpose." She gazed into Trin's eyes as if reassuring herself. "My students might still need me. Education and schools are bound to carry on, I'm sure. Math is a subject you cannot miss, isn't it? What about you and your family, Trin? Are you leaving at all?" "No, Miss Nguyen. We're staying as far as I know of, for now." Then she bowed her head once more in goodbye and walked toward the bike rack. Waiting for her turn, Trin pushed her bike out of the parking lot. Nguyen was next to her. "Are you going?" "Going where?" Jin replied with a question, pretending ignorance. "You know, going to America." The excitement of going overseas was apparent in the young girl's voice, even though she was clearly uncertain and sad about leaving the country and her friends. Trin was amused. She had asked Miss Nguyen the same question a moment ago. It was on the tip of everyone's tongue. "No, we're not going anywhere. Are you?" "Yes, we are. My father has to. He's worked for the US company IBM. His boss insists he and the family must get out of the country. I was going to say goodbye to you and everyone, even if Miss Nguyen hadn't dismissed the class today. You know Trang and Chung, the twins, in Year 7C? They left for France last week. They lived opposite my house. They came, said goodbye to me in the night, and left early in the following morning. The house was a shambles the moment they left. The looters were so swift. It's unreal. That beautiful house and furniture. Jin was not surprised at Lian's revelation. It was happening everywhere in the country in the last few months. The evacuations were the major focus of operations, and migration was the main motivation and discussion topic among the Southerners. My father doesn't want to go. His friends came and told him many times, but he refused, Lian. I overheard them talking. He has friends in the government, and many are leaving. One of them told him to come along as he had connections with the US Embassy. Drin added, feeling as proud and important as a strutting male peacock displaying his magnificent tail. But my father is an ex-government official, so he has priority as well. Still, he doesn't want to leave Vietnam. You should go then, Lian announced with finality. She waved her hand and then looked at Drin and swirled about her as if seeing the class and everything else for the first time. Lastly, she hopped on her bike and pushed it quickly and away without looking back. The rest of the day was quite humid and close. April in Saigon was always like this. The sky was cloudy as if waiting for rain, and the sun was high and bright. The combination of the two made the air as steamy as a giant sauna. Jen could feel beads of sweat dripping down her temples. The tutorial class was situated inside the local market, and today it was not crowded at all. That was very unusual, Jen thought. She pushed her bike out of the labyrinth of walkways and market stalls. It took her half the normal time without having to shove and duck through the throng. There were not many people on the streets either. Many shops were closed, and in those still open for business, the owners were gladly reaping the rewards as there was little competition. The prices of goods went up dramatically overnight, especially rice, sugar, salt, fish sauce, dried noodles, and necessities. A kilogram of rice would cost 500 dong the previous day, but then would double the amount the next day. Everyone was stocking up on his or her supply as much as possible, if not going out of the country. Many vacant houses were looted, and everything inside was taken. Looters were running wild with people's property on the streets. They were making profits and acting gleefully happy with their ill-gotten gains all over the collapsing city. Regardless of the somber atmosphere, they were pleased. In every ruin there are always profiteers, it seems. Rubbish was flying everywhere. There were bullet marks on some walls and a few holes here and there. The charred remains of a motorbike lay across the pedestrian path. An electric light pole was broken in half. The jagged edges looked sharp, and the wire was dangling loose on the pavement. It must have been very tall, as the broken section was now occupying a large part of the pavement. The debris of a concrete wall from a vacated office overflowed messily, destroyed by the profiteers. They knocked it down mercilessly in their hurry to scoop up the furniture and booty. Inside the front yard, some piles of rubbish were still burning, and smoke was billowing high. Someone must have burnt their files before they left. With this kind of weather, a real fire might start any time, Trin thought. Further down on her left, the guard station at the US-based civil service was deserted. The armed soldier with his M16 machine gun, ready to fire at suspicious activity, was no longer there. He must have been dismissed earlier and returned to his countryside homeland. Lucky for him, Trin thought. He would be there for his family during the last few days of the war at least. The tall barbed wire fence that served as a deterrent for intruders was intact. But the gate was wide open and the inner doors were unlocked. Nothing was left inside. Trin was quite sure of that. Trin did not know how to feel. She was so confused and afraid. She pushed her bike faster home. At least home was still relatively safe. She passed a crashed helicopter lying sideways in the park near her home. Luckily, its body was on the grass and not obstructing the traffic. The pilot might have had a narrow escape as the chopper was broken and damaged, but there was no sign of burning or an explosion. Yesterday afternoon, when it was downed, its wretched body still had the impressive look of power of a sophisticated flying machine. It had been looted extensively overnight, and today its pitiful remains were just an oversized metal dump that had been left behind, because there was nothing more that could be stripped away by passers-by. There was talk of going away to America, to France, to other foreign countries from everyone she met. Everyone wanted to leave, it seemed. The news and politics, mystifying and befuddling to a girl of 13 at that time, added to her confusion. All she knew was that the fighting was very close, in the vicinity of the capital city of Saigon. It had escalated a few weeks ago. The war was approaching for real. At night, there was gunfire and distant bombings. Sometimes they were so close that father had told everyone to sleep downstairs instead of the upper loft sleeping quarters. No one's allowed to sleep up there, all right, children? Gather around here at night and the curfew is 10 o'clock, so be home by then. Understand? Many households were building their bomb shelters right inside the living room. The makeshift shelter might have easily been destroyed by the smallest bomb. Drin guessed the people had known that for a certainty. However, the effort to salvage a sense of stability and safety was a necessary step for all, to keep their sanity intact, Drin thought. At the same time, the bomb shelter might serve as a common burial ground for the complete family unit if a disaster like that really happened. They wished for that final escape to ease the pain for all if it ever did. Some had declared casually, if the bomb actually exploded in the living room, then we'd all be together. No suffering. Drin understood that was also her father's intent from his insistence in ordering all of them around the living room and kitchen at night. Their family shelters were made of double layers of sandbags piled on top of the sturdy solid wood dining table and the beautiful large divan in the kitchen. The divan was so low that only 4 of the children, Juan, Kim, Drin, and Luke, could manage to crawl in. Drin recalled that it was strange that in a time of crisis one could be very afraid but at the same time very indifferent to danger in their surroundings. These contradictory feelings were bewildering to them citizens of Saigon and to the population of the South. They could cry and they could laugh. They cried when the imminent hazard was looming over their heads, and they laughed when it was quiet the day after. It was business as usual. They would just go on for another day. However, when the gunfire and bombing was heard in frightening successive rounds, then father would call everyone to emergency practice, the kids crawling under the divan and the adults under the dining table. Oblivious of the gravity of the situation, the children behaved as if they were having a party, unaware of the anxiety displayed on their parents' faces. Here we go again. Have you brought the melon seeds, Drin? They're still here, I think. Crawling further inward, Drin took out the bag of seeds hidden at the foot of the divan. Then they started munching the seeds and giggling in the darkened space, enjoying the strange effect of dancing with danger. The adults could not make them be more conscious, other than by ignoring their joyful innocence. Then, after a while, growing more immune to danger with so many practices, the adults joined in the party mood, behaving like children and starting to chat gaily in the crowded space. Father had to reprimand them and remind them to be quiet. Flirting with death and peril was a common practice with people who were faced with crisis for an extended amount of time. Fear was replaced by indifference and unconcern. The Vietnamese were no exception after the prolonged periods of war, since the anti-French resistance war in Vietnam, during the Second World War till now, over 30 years of bloodshed and carnage. Consequently, the effect of the threat was no longer felt, even though the threat itself was real and deadly. The possibility of exposure was diminished by individuals assuring themselves in times of calamity and danger that the worst might happen to someone else but that it would not happen to them, and so on. The longer they lived under the battle zones, the stronger their immunity to the effect of war. Drin's brother, Nguyen, who was in the army, sometimes told her of walking in battle zones with gunfire crisscrossing his path and ignoring it completely. They simply convinced themselves they were invincible. Similarly, the bomb shelters only served a few times in emergency practice, and then no one was willing to sleep or crawl under them anymore. Saigon was hot and humid with the approach of May, that it was torture in the crowded, suffocating space, and 100 times worse with fear. Gradually and strangely, the effect of being blown up was no longer accepted, as death seemed far-fetched for many Saigon dwellers. The feeling of being invincible became widespread as they had lived under secured protection for so long. Even in the fiercest fighting periods of 1968 and 1972, Saigon dwellers were always safe with troops scattered on the outskirts of the city at all times. Curfews had been in effect ever since Trin could remember. They had always been imposed in the country of the 100 years of French colonization. Trin was sure of that. There were restrictions on movement in the city and around the country after midnight. It was even stricter now. No one was protected on the street after dark. Either they ran the risk of being accused as a Viet Cong, being shot at accidentally if their behavior was considered suspicious by the South Vietnamese armed forces or the city army police, or conversely, of being shot at by the infiltrated Viet Cong of the North if considered on the South side. That was the hardest dilemma for the people in the Civil War. No one was safe to be considered friend or foe until proven so. Unfortunately, it could be too late to be perceived as an ally if the person was already a goner. Father was at home when Trin got in. He was at home more often than before since the intensity of the fighting had increased. He usually traveled to their 10-hectare block of land in Long Can, which was located 100 kilometers from Saigon. He stayed there for a few weeks now and then. It was his retirement investment, his dream of rambutan plantation. Rambutan was the prickly tropical fruit that Long Can was renowned for. Trin approached him when he waved her closer. He caught her skirt, pulled her toward him, and quickly gave her an embrace and a kiss on the cheek. He had to be quick as he was expecting a rebuke from his daughter. Trin was always annoyed and tried to break free. She was already too old for that. Her cheeks went red with embarrassment. For most Asians, hugging and kissing were not commonly practiced. It was only father, Trin thought, who had French influence and always showed his affection toward his children as freely as a Westerner. "Oh, father, let me go," she pulled herself vigorously away from his grasp. "So no more school for you, darling." Father let her go reluctantly, but he was amused at her reaction. "Yes, father, no more school. Yippee." "You wouldn't put up with doing nothing, my girl, I know you too well." "Yeah, why not? But I would. Because there is nothing I could do at the moment, father." Nguyen shook his head at his defiant youngest daughter. "Cheeky devil. Now run away, sweet pea. Go to the kitchen and help your mother. She's cooking lunch in there, and she's been by herself all morning. Be nice to her." Everything had halted in Saigon and in the South for almost 10 days since the change of presidency and after the talk of Americans leaving the country. Schools, offices, and some businesses were closed. The only activity that seemed lively was the discussion of how to get out of the country. Everything else was masked with despair and forlornness. People engaged in talk, debate, and speculation while waiting for destruction. At the same time, they were hoping for peace and stability to be regained. Their endurance was shredded thin. Regardless of the outcome and despite their dreadful fear of communism, they all wanted peace for their country. And Nguyen was one of them. He was an ex-director in the finance department of the government and was well-traveled. He had been to many places in South Vietnam as well as other Southeast Asian countries. Nguyen came from a wealthy family in Cần Thơ, whose land was bountiful and which provided higher education and comfortable, affluent lifestyles for him and his siblings. His family wealth was severely affected after the imposition of the agricultural revolution in 1955 by President Nguyen Diem, abolishing landlordism in the South. The majority of his family's land was divided into smaller sections for the peasants to purchase the land they were leasing. Father refused flatly when his mates asked him to join them in leaving the homeland, saying Vietnam had fought with the French for 100 years and has been in civil war for a quarter of a century. Now it's going to have peace. It's not the peace I want to see with the rule of Viet Cong, but it's peace after all. I was born when the First World War broke out, and I have seen through the Second World War with the French, with the Japanese right here in this tiniest and remotest land. I've practically grown up with war all my life. Gunfire, bombing, destruction, and death have been familiar for most of my life, and now I want to live in my homeland and see how peace has actually arrived. That was Father's opinion to whoever asked about his or her leaving or staying. However, he told others who had worked for the Americans or had connections with them or had wanted to leave because of their phobia of communism, just go. It's sad in a situation like this, but if circumstances indicate choosing to leave the country, then you must do it. Don't risk making yourself and your family enemies of the Viet Cong. I'm just a retiree, old and useless. I don't think I'm in any danger by staying back. Jin's half-sister, Betty, her father's eldest, who worked with a Taiwan agricultural company, who asked him, "Should my family and I leave too, father? Mr. Kuo offers his help in getting all of us to Taiwan within the next week. The company's closing its business and vacating the office today. They offer the staff the choice of going with them. What do you think I should do?" Father was reluctant to answer, but after a while he said, "You're my daughter, a grown-up daughter with a family to take of already, but you're still my daughter. I don't think I can bear the idea of you living in a foreign country that I'd have no connection with in the future. Being a past employee of the Taiwanese isn't as bad as being a past employee of the Americans. But if you think that's the best for you and your children, then of course, you must do what you think is right." Betty was a divorcee with 5 children under 18 at that time, but her salary provided her and the children a comfortable living. It was a difficult decision to make, as she knew that life would be 100 times harder with the change of government. Betty's final decision was to stay, and she suffered the terror and cruelty after the fall of Saigon with the rest of the population until her premature death. She could not leave her father at the time of the crisis, but she left him in the end after 2 years of living under the communists. She was a year short of turning 40. The family was under strain, with relatives and friends coming to say farewell and crying as they left. Trin had never seen the adults in so much distress. It was chaotic and frightening at the same time. Despite the speculation, the majority of the South was still in disbelief at the expected defeat. They were feeling dejected. The Americans were getting tired of the war, and the world was busy with other matters. Vietnam was only a small, pitiful, war-torn country that had too much of their attention for long enough. And now that was it. There was no time to fuss over her anymore. It was time to turn another page.